What would you do if the only sound on your morning run was a cry coming from a trash bag on the side of a foggy Oregon road? 3 bags, 3 dying dogs, and a Marine who swore no one gets left behind. He was not looking for a miracle. But when Logan knelt in the rain and cut the first knot, a trembling paw slid into his hands, and the poison on their breath told him time was running out. He lifted one, then another, and chose to fight a battle no one else could see. What happened next will make you believe in second chances. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments, and if you believe no human or animal should ever be left behind, hit subscribe, because this story might just restore your faith in miracles. Morning in Port Silverton did not arrive so much as it drifted in, a pale marine layer sliding off the Oregon coast and into the low streets, threading itself between cedar shingles and the harbor's tilted masts. The bay wore a belt of mist, gulls carved slow white signatures in the sky, a thin drizzle beaded on weathered mailboxes and on the hood of an old pickup that hadn't moved in days. The air had the metallic tang of salt and wet iron, the distant thump of a buoy bell, the hush of tidewater running up the estuary and then sighing back. Logan Mercer rose before the sun, because sleep was a stranger and routine was the only door that still opened. 35, tall and spare, he was the sort of man a tailor would call a bad advertisement. All function, no flourish. The marine buzz cut had softened to a practical crop, brown hair tamped by rain. His face kept the sharp geometry of long miles and longer nights. A silvery seam of a scar, too thin to brag about, too honest to conceal, ran from the corner of his left eye toward his temple. He had hands like useful tools, nicked and squared, the nails clean, the knuckles permanent maps of old knocks. When people did meet him, at the hardware counter, on the dock, once at church, they called him reserved, polite, the kind of politeness that is an off-ramp rather than an invitation. But under that was order, loyalty, and a stubborn kind of gentleness that had outlived dust storms and detonations. Afghanistan had cut a crater in his life and then left him to landscape around it, so he did what he could. He lived in a one-room cabin up on a weathered bluff where the firs leaned like eavesdroppers. The cabin was practical: an iron stove, a plank table, a cot that remembered his weight and sprang back resentfully when he rose. He repaired things for neighbors with cash, short and kindness long. He stacked his firewood with the precision of a field strip. He ran each morning along the river path because the rhythm, breath, step, was a metronome that could sometimes drown out memory. The weather today was what the locals called a soft rain, that impossible northwestern promise that you won't get wet until you realize you are soaked. He tugged on a faded navy hoodie, lace shoes already white-salted and split at the toes, and stepped out into the hush, the world no louder than his own breathing. The path unspooled from his door like a rope, down the bluff and onto a gravel track that followed the river where it shrugged itself toward the harbor. On the far bank, reeds shook off beads of rain. A heron lifted on hinged legs and measured out a new piece of water. The mist made even the pockmarked asphalt look gentler. Logan took the first bend fast to wake his legs, then settled into an easy lope, the drizzle prickling his cheeks. Breath, step, breath, step. He was 3/4 of a mile from the cabin, near a disused pullout where blackberry canes had colonized a no dumping sign when the air changed. Not the temperature, that held steady at 52, stubbornly maritime, but the feeling, as if a note had gone flat without anyone touching the instrument. He slowed. "Listen first," his sergeant used to say. The way a hunter listens to woods he thinks he knows. The river kept its secret, the gulls did not consult him. Then he saw them. 3 black shapes hunkered at the edge of the pullout, slick with rain, the plastic puckered into heavy, ugly fruit. From 20 feet, they might have been somebody's trashed lawn bags, punch-drunk on gravity. From 10, they were wrong. The first bag trembled. Not the plastic, not a trick of wind, but a ripple from inside, as if something had exhaled and found there was too little air. Logan stopped mid-stride. A familiar filament pulled tight inside his chest, the one that always snapped taut between suspicion and certainty. He had learned to distrust adrenaline. It lied like a talented thief. He approached anyway, because that's what he did when the world asked, and no one else was nearby to answer. He crouched. The rain hissed softly on plastic. Up close, the smell pushed at him first. Chemical and sour. Not the wet compost this roadside usually sponged up, but something sharper, like the bitter ghost of a cleaning agent leaving a bad marriage with meat. The knot at the top of the first bag was the quick work of thoughtless hands, a tug and twist. He pressed his fingers to the plastic, felt heat where there should have been cool. The bag twitched. "Easy," he said, because people say things when there's nothing to say. He looked over his shoulder out of habit. The road was empty, a gray tongue with nobody's name on it. He hooked his fingers into the twist and pulled. The knot resisted, cinched by rain and panic. He slid the blade of his runner's folding knife under the plastic and made one short, decisive cut. The bag sagged open like a held breath finally given back. The first eye he met was brown and enormous, ringed by a black mask of fur gone dull with grime. German Shepherd, male, he guessed without bothering to tell himself not to guess, maybe 4 years old, sable coat obscured by the mess of it, a blocky muzzle flecked with foam. The smell of chemical rose like a hot slap. The dog's ribs laddered under his pelt, lean, not with the grace of athletic muscle, but the narrowness of hunger. His paws were scabbed where somebody had tied something too tight for too long. His right foreleg twitched in an arrhythmic stutter, a marionette with the wrong puppeteer. But there was life there, a bright bead at the bottom of deep water. The animal's gaze flicked, tried to track, lost, then returned to the shape closest to hope. "I've got you," Logan said in the voice they give you when they hand you responsibility and tell you it has a pulse. He sliced another seam to open the bag further and slid his hands under a body both hot and shaking. The dog was heavier than he looked, 80, maybe 90 pounds. But Logan's arms remembered how to cradle weight that mattered. He lowered the shepherd onto the wet gravel, away from the chemical bath of the bag, and peeled the torn plastic aside as if it could forget what it had been made to do. The second bag moved as if in sympathy. He cut that one too, faster now, and met a different geometry of fear. Doberman, female, perhaps 2 years old, ears natural and folded, as if someone had spared her one cruelty while signing off on others. Her coat, black and rust, would have been something to admire under any other sky. Here it was dull with grime and salt. She was smaller than the shepherd, 55 pounds at most, but wound tight, trembling at a frequency that lived somewhere between panic and collapse. Her eyes were dark coins dropped in a deep well, reflective and quick. They flitted to his knife, and then to his vichin, and then to the shepherd already on the gravel. She tried to rise, legs buckling, a whisper of paw on stone, and then sank again as if gravity had grown partisan overnight. Her breathing came in ragged pulls, shallow, the way a creature breathes when it has learned that the world is, more often than not, a liar. He ran a palm slowly along her flank, felt ribs and then the hard clench of muscle too long in the service of fear. "Easy," he said again, lowering his voice further, almost to the register he used with the stove and the wind. The third bag did not move at all. He wished, for a selfish half-second, that it wouldn't. The rain thickened, sowing the fog to the road. He cut the knot anyway. The plastic sloughed back heavily. Rottweiler, male, 3 or 5 years. It's harder to tell with their square dignity, his mahogany points dulled by filth. His great head pillowed on a strip of plastic that had once been a grocery logo and was now a secret. He was thick through the chest, even starved, bred for strength but instructed in neglect, and his breath came at a stutter that had less rhythm than rain. His tongue was pale, a color that had no business in a living mouth. He did not open his eyes at first. When he did, they were the rich amber you find in driftwood when the tide turns it just right. They slid to Logan's face and then away, like someone remembering and trying not to. Logan took inventory the way he always did, assembling facts so his hands would know what to do, while his thoughts lost the argument about what shouldn't have been possible. 3 different breeds, 3 different weights, 3 different shapes of despair, all in bags tied by the same careless knot. The scar at his temple sang its thin electricity. The shepherd coughed, a sound like a hinge that had given up. The river out beyond the reeds lifted and dropped its own slow counterpoint. There would be a story about how they came here, and a worse story about who tied the knots, and the worse story about why. He could not know all that yet. He could know this. Nobody else was coming in the next 5 minutes. He shrugged out of his hoodie, then his thin running jacket beneath, slick with rain, and laid both over the shepherd and the Doberman like a makeshift truce with the weather. He slid his hands under the Rottweiler's chest and felt the answering push of a heart, working under protest. "All right," he said to all three at once, mostly to himself. A thought rose, uninvited, and with it a voice that never left. Sometimes it was a shout over rotor wash, sometimes it was a whisper in a broken building. Now it was the clear Midwestern baritone of Sergeant Cole Anders, as if he had just leaned in beside him on the gravel pullout outside Port Silverton, raindrops shining on a face Logan had not seen in 10 years. No one left behind. For a thin slice of a second, everything loosened. The stiff collar of memory, the way the world narrows to a point. The words made a space wide enough to stand in. He slid his arms under the Rottweiler again, heaved him clear of the bag. The big dog's head sagged toward his chest, as if to listen to the old oath beating there. The Doberman's ears flicked. The shepherd's eyes found him and did not let go. The drizzle became applause on the road, small and relentless. Logan looked at the empty stretch of asphalt, solemn at the fog erasing distance, at the river keeping its own counsel, and chose. He gathered breath into his ribs until it hurt the right way. "I've got you," he said, the words steadying his hands. He glanced toward the bend where his truck was parked, under the leaning firs, a quarter-mile away. Imagine the ignition catching, the heat vents wheezing their thin mercy, the gravel spitting under tires. He scooped the shepherd into his arms first, because triage is an old grammar he still spoke, and rose into the weight as if into a country he had promised to return to. The Doberman watched, trembling less, as if the spectacle of care could be contagious. The Rottweiler's eyes closed. Not the closing of the lost, but the brief surrender of the carried. Logan took a step, then another, the rain stitching his hoodie to the shepherd's coat, the fog making a corridor that led exactly where he would go next. The oath unspooled behind him like a lifeline. "No one left behind," he repeated, low, to the road that would bear his weight, to the river that had seen worse, and to the 3 lives that had been sorted by someone else into an answer he refused to read. He walked toward the bend, toward the truck, toward the next thing he could do. The road from the river to town curved like a wet blade, slick with drizzle and rimmed by alder and cedar that let go their fine rain in shivers. Logan drove with both hands high on the wheel, jaw set, shoulders tight, the heater sputtering fog from the vents that did almost nothing for the cold anchored behind his sternum. The German shepherd lay in the back seat on a spread towel, chest rising too fast, strings of foam at his lips thinning in the warm air. The Doberman curled against the passenger side floorboard, small and shaking, pupils wide and glossy. The Rottweiler took the cargo area, great head braced awkwardly against a coil of old rope, breaths a staggered metronome gone off beat. The wipers mapped a nervous rhythm across the glass. Port Silverton's harbor swung into view between low warehouses and the old cannery with its missing letters. Beyond it, the clinic's blue-painted cinder-block cube hunkered beside a feed store like a practical afterthought. Logan coasted into the gravel lot, gravel popping under his tires, left the engine running, and let motion fall out of his body so he could act. He said nothing that would waste breath. He lifted the shepherd first, unexpectedly heavy for an animal so lean, and carried him through a glass door choked with flyers for lost cats and vaccination drives and a smiling golden retriever in a Santa hat from 2 Decembers ago. A bell made a small, embarrassed sound. The reception counter was unmanned for half a second. Then a woman rose from behind a monitor, as if the desk had grown a person. She was in her late 20s, hair in a lopsided bun, freckles like constellations across her nose, wearing scrubs printed with cartoon paws bleached almost white from washing. Her name tag read Kara in block letters someone had filled with glitter pen. She took one look at Logan's face, a soldier's face stripped to utility, and at the shepherd's mouth, frothing pale, and dropped the clipboard she'd been holding. "Back room," she said, voice clean and decisive. "Now." She swung a gate, shouted over her shoulder without turning. "Dr. Hartman!" The clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet wool, and something sweet like bubblegum toothpaste, undercut by the metallic edge of fear. A swinging door gave onto a treatment area with stainless tables, a bank of humming machines, and a whiteboard printed with schedules and wiped half-legible names. A woman in slate-gray scrubs stepped out from a side exam room, pulling a stethoscope from around her neck, as if she'd been born with it and had only just remembered. She was 40, compact and weatherproof, with the posture of someone who spent her life between crouching and moving quickly. Her dark hair was cut blunt at the jaw, a few rebellious strands tucked behind one ear while they regrouped. Fine lines at her eyes had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with weather and long nights. Dr. Emily Hartman carried a stillness inside her. That did not argue. People obeyed the stillness because it felt earned. She took in the shepherd, the Doberman quivering in the doorway, the dim shape of the Rottweiler beyond, and the man who held them all together by nothing but will. "How long?" she asked. "Found them 20 minutes ago," Logan said. "Bags. Chemical smell. All three were breathing. He's worst," he added, nodding toward the Rottweiler, though it felt like choosing between house fires. "Kara, get me charcoal, IV kits, and oxygen. Nate, call in. We need help." A young tech shouldered through from the kennel hallway, tall in green scrubs a size too big, sandy hair falling into his eyes, and a tattoo of a line-drawn mountain peeking from his sleeve. Nate moved with an earnest haste, the kind you find in people who haven't yet learned how heavy a mistake can be. He grabbed a cart without questions. Emily's hands went to work on the shepherd, gauging gum color, palpating abdomen, counting respirations like a drumbeat only she could hear. "Poison," she said, as if telling the air what it already knew. Probably organophosphates from a cleaning compound or pesticide slurry if the smell was solvent sharp. She glanced at Logan, the way a teacher checks a student's comprehension. "We're going to decontaminate and bind what's in their guts, support breathing, protect airways, then pray to every saint of small victories." Logan nodded, as if taking orders after a briefing. Emily snapped a muzzle gently around the shepherd's snout, not for trust, but for reflexes that don't know the difference between help and harm, then slid a catheter in with the patience and economy of motion that years grant. Fluids hung, a clear gravity he had always trusted. Kara brought oxygen and a little mask molded for muzzles. The shepherd's chest fought, lifted, fought again. "Sir," Nate said, eyes flicking to the cargo door, "the big one's going cyanotic." "He's the priority," Emily said without heat. "But they all are priorities. That's the problem with triage in threes." She looked at Logan again and saw more than readiness. She saw that look, the unwelcome camera flash from a theater the world had already struck its set. "You Army?" "Marine," he said. A ghost of a smile, it made something softer move behind her eyes. Figures. The work became a choreography. Wash chemical residue from their fur where the bags had trapped it, draw blood into small tubes that looked indecently bright against the stainless, monitor heart rate on machines that beeped in tones kinder than their meanings. Logan stayed out of the way by staying in the way, his hands where Emily told him to put them, his weight anchoring the Rottweiler so Nate could fit the mask to that square face and get oxygen moving in. He held the Doberman while Kara pushed activated charcoal through a syringe, the black slurry smearing her lips in a messy mustache that would have been funny if anything had been funny. The Doberman shuddered at the taste and then stilled, eyes following Logan's mouth as if reading words there, as if a voice could be a rope. And then, for a slice of a mean minute, the Rottweiler's heart monitor flattened. It didn't become silent. The machine sang a high, unbroken tone that made everything inside Logan recoil violently, as if a wire had been yanked through him. He didn't think. Some old channel opened, and he was back in gravel and flame and heat, holding a friend whose name he could still say in the dark, except that friend had a square head and amber eyes and a chest that refused to lift. Emily was already there, sternum rub, airway check, a measured push of antidote she'd drawn up when she saw his gums pale. Nate froze, then unfroze like a film jump cut, and readied the ambu bag. Kara's hand hovered at the oxygen line like a saint in a church mural. "Stay with me," Logan said, his voice not rising, not performing, simply laying a path in front of the struggling heart. He kept one hand on the dog's shoulder, felt the heat seeping like a fever that meant chemical war inside, and he kept saying it softly, because some words you repeat until the room remembers them. "Stay with me. Stay with me." The monitor stuttered back into a rhythm, messy but present. A percussion section finding its way after a missed cue. Emily didn't smile. She breathed. "Good," she said to everyone and no one. "Good, big guy." She didn't clap or waste the moment on relief. She folded it away like a clean bandage for later. She drew blood again, added a med to his fluids that would give his liver a fighting chance, adjusted the mask, and nodded once at Logan in a language made of economy. You were useful. Keep being that. Through the next hour, time did the rubber thing it does in rooms where outcomes feel like doors in a storm, stretching and snapping back. The shepherd's tremors eased, his breathing tucked itself into a shallower groove. The Doberman's eyes lost their frantic glitter and blinked, slow, suspicious blinks that meant she was trusting the present more than whatever had trained her to flinch. The Rottweiler lay huge and wrong-colored at the gums, fights, and lulls, the monitor tattling on every falter and then forgiving it. Logan worked inside his body the way a man works inside a scaffold that might collapse if he moves too fast. He remembered lifting Corporal Ruiz off scree while the sky bled fire and the radio chewed numbers. He remembered how Ruiz's breath came in bursts on his neck like small apologies. He set the memory down where it wouldn't shake his hands, and he kept doing ordinary things extraordinarily well, holding, steadying, hearing instruction once, and acting like he'd known it all his life. "You live alone?" Emily asked, during a lull that wasn't a lull, only fewer demands in the same tight space. It wasn't small talk, it was triage of a different kind. "Cabin North Bluff," he said. "Work odd jobs. Fix things." "That tracks," she said, adjusting a drip. "You have the look of a man who fixes things other people break." She rinsed charcoal from her gloves at the sink, the water going black and then clear. "I'm Emily. People call me Em unless I look tired, and then they call me doctor, like a prayer. I grew up here, left for vet school, came back when my dad's heart decided he'd fished long enough. He liked the bay even when it was trying to kill him. I like it too." She said it like a confession to the room, as much for the dogs as for the man. Nate reappeared with a warming pad and slid it under the Doberman, with the kind of careful you only learn by breaking something once. "You're doing fine," Emily told him, and the way she said fine made it sound like a promotion. Kara moved to the phone, dialing with quiet ferocity. "Calling in Tessa from On Call," she explained, as if anyone had questioned her. "And I texted my brother to grab extra towels from Mom's. He'll leave them at the door." The clinic had become its own small republic, where help enacted itself without ceremony. The rain softened outside, ticking now instead of hissing. A gull yelled about something unimportant. Emily checked the shepherd's pupils again, pressed fingers to the femoral pulse, and then turned to the Rottweiler. She peeled back a lip and frowned at the blanching, the capillary refill time a beat too long. "He's going to stay," she said, mostly to herself and then to Logan. "All of them if I had my way, but at least this big guy needs continuous monitoring for the next 24 to 48 hours. The shepherd and the Doberman, if they stabilize over the next couple of hours, we may be able to discharge into close home care with strict instructions. I'll send you with meds, dosing charts, my cell for when something happens at 2 a.m., because it will." Her eyes met his, as if measuring whether the cabin on the bluff had room for more than one kind of recovery. Logan nodded once, like a man signing a contract with his own better self. "I can follow instructions." "I figured," she said. "You have that face." "What face?" "The I carry their weight or I don't go home face." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't not. The shepherd coughed and then sighed in a way that did not terrify her. The Doberman's head found the crook of Logan's ankle and stayed there, a small, deliberate claim. The Rottweiler slept the sleep of the deeply monitored, his pulse a debate that edged in the right direction often enough to keep the room's shoulders from climbing to their ears. Nate's phone buzzed. He glanced. "Tessa's 10 minutes out," he reported. "Good," Emily said. She turned to Logan and spoke like a general in a war where mercy was the only tactic worth rehearsing. "Here's the plan. We hold the line. We keep them breathing, keep toxins bound, protect organs from a job they didn't sign up for. When Tessa arrives, we rotate, so nobody's hands go stupid. If the shepherd and the Doberman continue to respond, we'll get you set up with supplies and instructions this evening. The Rottweiler stays. He'll be mad at me later, which I'll count as success." Logan let out a breath he hadn't noticed hoarding. He touched the shepherd's paw and felt the answering curl of toes. Reflex or gratitude, he didn't overthink it. He pressed 2 fingers lightly to the Doberman's chest and felt the small thump-thump he'd bargained with the universe for. He looked at the Rottweiler and said nothing, because sometimes a silence is the only honest offering you can bring to a long negotiation. Emily wrote orders in a blocky hand that looked surprisingly like a dock worker's chalk, then softened her voice the way you speak to a skittish colt. "You did right bringing them," she said without any frosting of sentiment. "You did fast. Sometimes that's the difference." Logan nodded, because compliments sat awkward on his frame, but truths did not. Outside, the rain thinned to something that could almost be called a pause. Inside, machines kept up their small conversations with living things. The clock above the whiteboard declared a time that meant nothing to anyone in the room, except as a measure of distance between a before they did not want and an after they hadn't yet earned. When the bell over the front door rang again and a second tech's footsteps hurried down the hall, Logan did not look up. He was busy holding a paw, steadying a mask, and schooling his breath to the shape of hope. By late afternoon, the rain had thinned to a salt mist that silvered every windshield in Port Silverton and slicked the clinic's cinder-block walls until they looked like the hide of some patient sea creature. Inside, the air still held that braided smell of disinfectant, wet fur, and warm plastic from the IV lines. Papers appeared, not the kind that fence people in, but the kind that teach you how to keep breathing. Dosing sheets, timing charts, a hand-drawn schedule in blocky letters that looked like a dock worker's tally. Fluids, meds, food, measured by cups instead of hope. Emily Hartman went over each page with the precision of someone who understood that information could be a life jacket. She tapped spots with a capped pen, not to scold, but like a conductor setting tempo. "Rex first, because he'll let you," she said, nodding at the German shepherd, whose sable coat had dried to reveal a freckling of lighter guard hairs along his shoulders. Up close in daylight, Rex read as a dog in his prime boxed into the wrong story. Perhaps 4, maybe 5, a deep chest that had known running, a head square enough to rest a whole hand, eyes the warm brown of old coffee cooling in a mug. Even exhausted, he was the sort that would rise to greet a sound at the door, not because he doubted you, but because vigilance was a form of devotion. "Shadow next," Emily continued, and the Doberman flicked one soft ear at the sound of her temporary name. Shadow was smaller boned than Rex, maybe 2 years and change, all sweep and angle, black and rust like a night road marked with foxfire. Scars in her mind were doing the talking for now, tightening the wires that ran between noise and panic. But her gaze had begun to steady, as if the world were finally willing to hold still long enough for her to examine it. Feed small, often. Water, little sips. Stomach needs mercy. Keep both warm but not hot. Make a nest. Give exits. PTSD in dogs, like in humans, hates a corner. Emily handed over a fabric cone, soft, gray, less like a satellite dish and more like an apologetic pillow, only if they start chewing at lines or wounds. She tucked a small notepad in with the meds. "Write everything. When it goes bad at 2 in the morning, writing is the bridge back to the plan." A new technician had come on shift, a woman in her early 30s with wheat blonde hair braided down her back, sleeves pushed to the elbow to show a constellation of old nicks from cats who had strong opinions and bad negotiation skills. Tessa Boyd had a face that could hold 2 truths at once, kindness and the refusal to be lied to by symptoms. She packed a discharge kit with the care of someone wrapping gifts at a table in December. Syringes, gauze, a digital thermometer, a cheap stethoscope whose color tried too hard. "If you see pale gums, slow cap refill, labored breathing, call," Tessa said, demonstrating the gum press on Shadow with a gentle thumb that made the dog accept what she might have flinched from an hour ago. "And if calling feels like not enough, come back. Door's not locked to you." In the back room, Titan lay under a quiet heat lamp, the Rottweiler's massive frame minimized by the careful geometry of blankets. The big head turned when Logan stepped through the doorway. Amber eyes opened to a slit and tracked him with the cautious relief of someone who has learned not to hope out loud. Titan up close was a study in contradictions, a neck like a dock piling, but a mouth that softened around the oxygen line, a broad chest that promised power but rose and fell with the measured caution of a traveler who knew the route could wash out. Mahogany points along his cheeks dulled to cinnamon by antiseptic. If strength had a color, it would have been that deep gloss under the grime, now returning in patches, as if the body were remembering its original story. "He stays," Emily said quietly, not because she needed to assert authority, but because truth is a kind to kindness. "Couple of days. I'll send updates. Swing by if you can. He'll listen even if he can't get up yet. Titan blinked and, by way of answer, pushed the tip of his tongue against the oxygen cone, as if to test its patience. Logan set a palm on the edge of the kennel. "I'll come," he said, voice even, "every day." They staged the exit like a small campaign. Rex walked under his own power, proud even in fatigue, accepting a slip lead with the practical dignity of a dog learning a temporary ritual. Shadow had to be lifted at first, then agreed to walk as long as Logan's knee was within her forward focus, her narrow paws placing themselves delicately on linoleum as if it might lie. Kara propped the door with a hip. Nate carried the supplies like a pack mule who had volunteered. Tessa called after them to remind about the 10 p.m. dose, and then made an "I'm watching you" sign at Shadow that somehow didn't spook her. The truck's cab filled with the quiet kinds of sound, Rex's sigh settling into the back seat, the papery whisper of a paper bag on the floor, the mutter of the heater. Outside, Port Silverton's early evening looked like somebody had set a pearl in fog. Gulls wheeled with after-work opinions, and the cannery's missing letters tried and failed to spell something optimistic. The road home was shorter because direction is an anesthetic. Logan drove with one eye on the rear view, where Rex held the kind of stillness that reads as thoughtfulness in dogs, and one eye on the shoulder, where the river slid beside them like a horse with its own hard pace. The cabin admitted them the way it always admitted the weather, without protest or pretense. The single room wore its usefulness plainly: iron stove, plank table scarred by tools and meals, a cot with a sag that mapped his bones, shelves of screws and baby food jars, a row of mugs that each could swear they were the right one. He knelt and made nests as instructed, towels layered inside old moving blankets, one under the window with the glass cracked to let out the damp stove heat when it came, one near the stove where warmth would pool but not scald, space enough around each nest to make retreat an option, bowls placed not symmetrically but considerately. He unrolled a yoga mat he didn't admit to owning so that Shadow could find traction when the floor felt too slippery to trust. He set the meds on the table, labeled with a black marker and letters big enough to read while tired. Rex, AM, PM, Shadow, small feedings, both, water sips. He set his kitchen timer, an old metal bell with a bossy face, for the evening doses, because clocks in crisis should talk back. Feeding was an exercise in humility and curiosity. Rex took to the small bowls of bland food, the way a polite guest eats without asking for more. He paused between bites, as if listening for instructions, then finished and took a drink with his eyes half closed, the canine version of a grateful nod. Shadow sniffed the bowl like a detective reading a suspect, glanced at the door twice, then decided to try 2 mouthfuls and stop, ears working, tail low. Logan did not coax or narrate, just sat on the floor a yard away, elbows on knees, the kind of posture that tells a nervous creature that you are not a problem to solve. When the stove caught and began its metallic chuckle, warmth spread with the slow authority of a blanket being pulled over a sleeping child. Rex curled into the nest near the window where the mist had given way to a grayer dark, and the raindrops now drew their quiet Morse code across the glass. Shadow took the nest near the stove, but lay with her face turned toward the door, as if choosing to sleep on the threshold between staying and fleeing. Logan washed the bowls, arranged the syringe like a schoolteacher laying out chalk for tomorrow, and then, because the room did not need his movement anymore, he let stillness take his bones. Night invented new shapes in the corners. Wind shouldered at the eaves with the half-hearted insistence of a drunk cousin. Somewhere a branch ticked the roof with repetitive argument. The first whimper came thin, almost polite, the way a person might clear a throat before a request. The second arrived with the sharp edge of a saw catching on a knot. Shadow had sprung to her feet without moving, her whole body going from soft coil to electrified wire. The whites of her eyes showed, not cartoonishly, but in small crescents that meant panic had decided it could breathe here after all. Logan lifted his head slowly, then didn't rise. "It's okay," he said, not to dismiss but to name. Shadow's ears flattened. The air above her shoulders prickled, as if a storm had localized itself on a nervous system. She stepped back, banged a hip against the chair leg, the sound a gunshot to memory, and then she did it. Fast, apologetic, a snap you could miss if you blinked. Her teeth found his, forearm through the fabric of his sleeve, a press that registered as pain but not malice, then released. The world waited to see who he would be next. He did not flinch back. He did not flood the room with voice. He kept his arm where it had been and lowered his eyes not in submission but in invitation. "Okay," he said again, lower now, the words shaped around the space he was making. He slid, slowly as weather, from chair to floor, his back to the side of the plank table, legs folded, palms open and visible on his knees. The stove clicked, a small domestic punctuation. Shadow stood a long time in a pose that could have been misread as readiness to attack, but was actually the lost geometry of a creature caught between two maps. Her breathing made a small saw of the air. Rex lifted his head but did not rise. Leadership sometimes looks like stillness. Minutes passed in the specific stretch that belongs to animals working out the math of safety. Then Shadow's ears twitched. A test balloon. She stepped once, twice, 3 times, placing each paw with the concentration of a tightrope walker in a room full of floor. She came near enough to catch his scent. Soap, wool, wood smoke, rain, and near enough to see that his eyes did not mine for her secrets. She shivered, looked away, then looked back. The third look stayed. When she crawled into his lap, it was not a cinematic collapse, but a gradual surrender, a series of decisions carried out by muscle and breath. She tucked her long nose into the crook of his elbow, like something finding its original shape. Her ribs moved against his forearm in an exhausted tempo that nevertheless chose the future. He did not stroke her. He let the weight settle and become part of his own balance. He said nothing for a long time, and then, because silence had done its work, he offered a sentence to the room, like a prayer that did not demand anything. "You're safe," he said. The stove popped in agreement. Rain went on practicing its alphabet on the glass. Eventually, he slept there on the floor, with his back against the table, and Shadow a warm parenthesis around his arm. The timer on the counter blinking patiently toward the next dose like a lighthouse that understood routine is a kind of mercy. Morning did not so much arrive as admit that darkness had done enough. Shadow woke him by breathing a question on his wrist, and then, when he did not startle, making a small sound that in another life would have been called a laugh. Rex stood, stretched in a long downward arc that would make a yoga teacher feel redundant, and touched his nose briefly to Shadow's flank, a gesture of team more than affection. They performed the morning in the order Emily had written: water first, then a handful of food, then meds in the mouth like a shared secret, and the world did not break when they did. After the 10 a.m. check, Logan locked the cabin and drove back to the clinic with an emptiness on the passenger seat that told the truth about attachment. Tessa met him at the door with the kind of smile you bring to a tired man. Small, factual, no glitter. Titan had held his numbers through the night, with the tenacity of a barge gnawing upriver. Color was bleeding back into his gums like dawn deciding to try again. In the kennel room, Logan pulled up a plastic chair and leaned forward, elbows on thighs, as if to be closer were, to lend breath by osmosis. "I brought your fan club's report," he told Titan, holding up a folded sheet on which he had written the night's vitals in his spare, tidy hand. 2 bowls consumed, Shadow negotiated a peace treaty, Rex remains a gentleman. Titan's tail made a single thump against the blanket, a quiet drumbeat that suggested someone had called cadence in a language all 3 of them spoke. The days bracketed themselves like cautious bookends. Morning, cabin care, tight routine, small victories that you would miss if you were looking for fireworks. Afternoon, the drive to town, the clinic's reliable hum, Titan testing the oxygen cone's patience less and the water bowl more. Evening, back home, stove lit, the timer's bell, Shadow sometimes starting and then remembering, Rex sometimes standing in the doorway as if counting clouds. On the 3rd day, Emily met him with that not smile again, the one that held relief by the scruff. "He can try home," she said. "No heroics, stairs slow, monitor. Call me if his breath writes a different poem." They staged the reunion without theatrics because the heart notices the smallest things first. Titan came out under his own power, legs careful, dignity intact in the way only a Rottweiler can carry it, even when wearing a shaved patch and a bandage that made him look like a veteran of a quieter war. His coat had begun to shine again where cleanliness permitted. His eyes were clearer, and when he saw Logan, he did the kind of tail wag that starts low, like an engine deciding to turn over, and then commits. In the truck, Titan dropped his great head on the seat between them, not a plea but a declaration that this was the correct geometry. The cabin received the third bed without complaint. Rex approached first like a captain greeting a returning officer, nose to flank, a breath exchanged, a small calibrated bump that meant both hello and you are expected. Shadow circled once, twice, and then, in a choice that would have sounded like a cheer if she'd had human lungs, lay down with her back to Titan, trusting him to watch the door she had policed for nights. Logan set the evening doses where the timer could boss them back into order, then sat on the floor between all three as if he had been built as a tripod and finally remembered how to stand. Outside, the rain had finally gone from sentence to ellipsis. The mist hung, but the world beneath it felt legible. Inside, the room contained breath, warmth, and a procession of small sounds that, if you closed your eyes, made the same shape as a word you hadn't said out loud in years. Home, maybe. For now, temporary. Sometimes temporary is the bridge that holds. Morning slid into the cove like a shy guest, low fog resting its chin on the docks, while a thin band of sunlight tested the edges of Port Silverton's roofs. The rain had quit arguing overnight, leaving the firs glittering, as if someone had stitched dew into them with a fine needle. In the cabin on the bluff, the stove still remembered last night's fire and offered a lingering warmth. On the floor, 3 beds formed a loose triangle around a man who woke to the small chorus of breath that wasn't his. Rex rose first, the German shepherd unfolding from his nest near the window with a deliberate stretch that lengthened every line of him. Even skinny, he carried a kind of square-shouldered dignity, sable coat scattering pale highlights along his back, eyes a coffee brown that checked the door before it checked the bowl. Shadow woke with a start, as if sleep were a room she had overstayed in. She was a fine-boned Doberman of maybe 2, black and rust like lacquered wood. The angles of her face softened now that food and quiet had started doing their work. Titan came up last, the Rottweiler moving carefully, as if taking inventory of each joint. The mahogany points on his cheeks coming back to life under better meals and fewer poisons. His eyes met Logan's in a slow, assessing glance and settled. This was still the right room. Logan ran the morning like a checklist drafted by Mercy. Water first in measured sips, modest breakfast, meds slipped with the tenderness of a secret, a short walk to the clearing behind the cabin, where the river's breath could be heard if you stood still enough. It was there, with the fog thinning into strings and the gulls rehearsing their diatribes, that the first wound showed itself in daylight. Logan picked up the slip lead they'd used at the clinic and let it hang open like a question. Rex watched it with the particular focus of a dog who has learned to interpret nouns as weather. His ears pricked and then slicked back half a notch, his tail dipped, and his paws did a small, nearly invisible shuffle backward. The shepherd's body did not scream fear so much as whisper refusal. The refusal had nothing to do with defiance and everything to do with a memory attached to the idea of a loop closing. Logan didn't say it's okay because he was learning that Yppersteed could be traps. He crouched, turned his side to Rex instead of his front, and laid the lead on the ground between them like a bridge he would not force anyone to cross. He waited, the air around them holding the river's steady hush. Rex lowered his head, sniffed the nylon, then lifted his gaze to Logan's face with a question in it. What does this mean here? Logan answered with action, not argument. He slid the lead aside and lifted from a bag a soft, padded harness he had stitched together late last night from an old canvas tote and webbing. No tight circles, no surprise pressure, just fabric that rested and buckles that negotiated. He let Rex place his nose through the open space on his own. The dog paused, then did it, that small forward choice, and Logan fastened the chest strap with a click so calm it barely had a sound. Rex stood, tested the feel, and then, finding no old ghost lurking there, took 3 steps forward because forward was a word his body still knew how to speak. Progress, noted without triumph, banked like a small fire against later weather. The day went on teaching him its map. Inside, the cabin was a patient kind of mess, gauze in a jar, dozing chart on the table, bowls lined like modest pewter moons by the mat. Shadow drifted through the rooms as if she needed to keep 3 exits in sight. The smallest sound would turn her head. The larger ones made her flinch. Mid-morning, as Logan set a kettle on, the lid slipped and skittered across the stove ring with a metallic rasp. Shadow wasn't on the floor anymore. She was air. And then she was under the table, ribs pressed to wood, eyes gone big and rimmed with white. The sound itself had been nothing, but the sound, plus a history had made a door open to somewhere she didn't want to be. Logan didn't crawl after her or try to make the table a gentler shape with his hands. He lowered the lid back onto the ring with care, let the room relearn quiet, then sat on the floor halfway between her and the nearest exit, back against the couch, knees up, profile turned so his eyes didn't press. Shadow's breath came fast through her nose. Her paws scrabbled once against the rough plank, as if testing whether the floor would still be there. He made his body into a weight the room could trust, humming a tune that had no name and barely any notes, the kind of almost music you hear from a man in a shop who isn't aware he's singing. 5 minutes is a long time if you fill it with fear. 10 minutes can be a lifetime if you fill it with waiting that is not threatening. At 12 minutes, Shadow slid forward, the careful belly crawl of a creature negotiating with past and present. At 13, she was close enough to smell the wool in his sweater. At 14, she blinked. Once, twice, and the pupils lost their hard edge. He did not reach. He let choice do its work. She placed her chin on his ankle, which was all the way from panic to, for now, and the kettle remembered it had something to say and whistled low, as if embarrassed. Afternoon brought the wind up from the water, a clean push that moved the fog into the trees. Logan took them out along the river road for a careful loop. The world was itself again, docks and nets and the cannery's half-name, windows reflecting a sky that had decided to keep its promises. At the curve past the feed store, a figure came toward them on the shoulder. A man in his 60s, black wool cap pulled low, the kind of face that had weather written into it in fine script. Gray stubble like salt spray. Shoulders stooped in the way of people who have worked with their hands so long. Their bodies bent toward whatever needed repairing. He wore a navy jacket scuffed at the elbows and carried a mended crab ring that clicked now and then against his knee. Roy Pike nodded the way men in small towns nod. Yes, I see you. No, I won't make a fuss. Titan saw him first, head lifting, the big body slowing, a sound building low in his throat that wasn't a bark and wasn't a warning, so much as a letter addressed to the past. That hat. It wasn't volume, it was intent. The Rottweiler's hackles didn't rise, but his eyes hardened and his weight shifted forward a fraction. Logan shortened the harness line without yanking, stepped sideways so his body formed a wall between Titan and the man, and said in a voice that had learned to carry instruction without heat, "Good boy, with me." Roy stopped a respectful distance out of the lane of worry. From here, Logan could see the details that would make a dog decide. Cap shadowing the eyes, hand lifting with the crab ring, making a silhouette that might echo a different gesture. "You're fine, friend," Roy said, not to Logan, but to the dog. His voice a gravel road in summer. He angled his face so the cap's brim didn't turn his eyes into something dark and unreadable. "Don't like hats, do you?" Titan's growl thinned into a hum and then into breath. His gaze flicked to Logan and then back to the man. The big square head lowered a notch. "We'll let you pass," Logan said evenly. "Appreciate the space." Roy tipped his chin, took a step wide, and carried on. Titan tracked him until the jacket's scuffing became just movement, and the cap was only a piece of cloth again. Then, with a small, almost sheepish huff, he leaned his shoulder into Logan's thigh and walked, the big body falling into step with a relief that lived somewhere between apology and pride. Back at the cabin, a new thing waited on the porch, a white envelope tucked between the doorframe and the weathered welcome mat, the flap held with a sticker shaped like a paw print. Logan noticed the telltale carefulness of the placement, centered, just high enough to stay dry, angled like someone had tested 3 positions before trusting the wind. He scanned the yard automatically and caught a glimpse near the fence of a small figure in a bright yellow rain jacket with daisies printed on the cuffs. The hood had slid back to reveal straight brown hair cut in a blunt line at the jaw, and under the hair a face made of intent, brows knit, mouth a firm line that wanted to smile but was busy being brave. She was maybe 8 or 9, slight, the quick, coiled energy of a kid who climbs trees faster than she talks. When she saw him see her, she didn't run. She lifted one hand in a wave that was more about acknowledging a job completed than about greeting, then turned and trotted along the fence line to a modest house whose porch sagged in the middle, in the way porches do when a grandparent sits in the same spot every morning. June Alvarez, he would learn later from the return address on a library book notice that arrived in his mailbox by mistake, Lived with her grandmother and a black cat who tolerated humans but had a soft spot for tuna. For now, she was simply a careful child whose courage smelled faintly of crayon. Inside the envelope, a folded sheet lined with the faint blue bars of school paper, a drawing of 3 dogs with hearts for noses, and looping printing. Thank you for saving them. I think the brown one is brave. From June, age 9. The J had a flourish that wanted to be older than the hand that made it. Below the words, 3 paw prints stamped in purple ink marched in a line, then veered off like they'd remembered there was something important to do. Logan stood with the letter in his hand, longer than a person stands with paper usually. Some weight he had been carrying shifted in his chest and made a new shelf for itself. He taped the note to a cabinet door at eye level and, without ceremony, nodded at it as if it had said something wise. Dusk came early because the cove kept the sun for itself and parceled it out in miserly wedges. The stove took a new flame, the room shrugged into the familiar comfort of lamplight and the smell of things drying. Shadow tested the perimeter twice, then claimed the bed nearest the stove and placed her back toward open space of her own choosing. Rex lay near the window where he could keep an ear on the world's small warnings. Titan parked by the door in the posture of a sentry, on unassigned duty, big body, a reassurance you could trip over in the dark if you weren't careful. Logan washed the last bowl, wiped the table, set the timer for the midnight check, and lay down on the cot without undressing. Not because he expected to sleep through, but because sometimes pretending is the bridge to doing. The nightmare did not announce itself like a thunderclap. It seeped in through a seam somewhere between quiet and memory, and then was all there. A building he knew too well. Heat, not stove heat, but the oily breath of burning, pressed at his face. Gravel bit his knees. Someone was yelling numbers. A radio was reciting the alphabet like a dying man's prayer. Everything tilted wrong. He tried to lift, but the air had weight. He tried to see, but dust had become a curtain, thick enough to stop thought. His mouth shaped a name that decided not to leave. The old, awful silence after a blast, the silence that is not silence but the erasure of everything that should be loud, filled his head. He sat up hard, the cot complaining under him, a noise torn out of him that had not been shaped for rooms. The cabin's soft dark snapped back into place, but his body hadn't gotten the memo. His breath came in short, sharp shovelfuls. His hands had closed into fists without asking permission. There was movement before thought. Rex hit the cot in a single, contained leap. 80 pounds of intelligent gravity, landing chest to chest, not pinning, not scrambling, just present with enough weight to argue with panic. The shepherd's head pressed into the hollow below Logan's collarbone, the big skull heavy in the precise way that tells a nervous system which direction to go. Shadow materialized at the side of the cot, paws on the frame, eyes searching his face, and then the room, and then his face again. A small sound in her throat that might have been a question or might have been a reminder that air still existed. Titan stood at the door, ears up, head high, the wordless promise of force held in abeyance but available. Logan's fists opened like stubborn flowers. He put one hand on Rex's shoulder and felt the steady underheat of life, that uncomplicated engine. He counted 3 breaths into the dog's ruff. 5, 7, until numbers were just breath. Something in him gave way then, not like a building collapsing, but like an old knot loosening, because a better use had been found for the rope. He cried without the apology men sometimes attach to tears. It came quiet and long, and then shorter, and then it ended because it had done its work. Rex stayed until the shaking went from earthquake to aftershock to the kind of tremor you hug without talking about. Shadow licked the back of his wrist once, and then, satisfied that the room had returned to the correct shape, disappeared under the cot where she liked to listen to breathing. Titan lowered himself to the floor by the door and let out a long exhale a sergeant would have called a report. Area secure. Logan lay back on the thin pillow, the dog's weight half on him, the timer's red hand creeping toward midnight in a way that meant time was a friend again. He stared at June's letter taped to the cabinet where the lamplight just reached and thought that maybe healing wasn't a flag you planted so much as a road you learned how to walk without arguing with every step. When the timer chimed, a small metal insistence that had saved more than soup, he wiped his face with his sleeve, checked water bowls, counted pills, and whispered into the room, not a promise he couldn't keep, not a vow that required ceremony, just a simple, continuous assignment he knew how to do. Keep going. Port Silverton woke to a rare sky the color of watered milk with a rim of clean blue, the kind of morning fishermen bless and roofers respect. The bay held its breath as if the tide itself were listening. In the cabin on the bluff, Logan folded the night away like a blanket and moved through the routine with the quiet competence that had replaced sleep. Water bowls, small breakfasts, pills tucked like secrets. A slow walk that was more about smelling the news than covering distance. Rex wore the padded canvas harness without flinching now, a square-shouldered sentinel in a sable coat threaded with pale hairs like frost on cedar. Shadow matched pace at his knee, sleek and watchful, black and rust with ears that did algebra on the wind. Titan came last by choice, the Rottweiler's great head swinging with the dignified patience of a convalescent who refuses to be theatrical about it. By mid-morning, he had them settled and the dosing chart squared to the salt-shine table. The day would not let him be merely a caretaker. It had the feeling of a map drawing itself. Emily Hartman met him in the clinic's back room, in slate-gray scrubs and a fleece vest, a coffee mug the color of overcast clutched in one hand, and a Ziploc bag of gloves and swabs in the other. In the sober light, she was all straight lines and quick eyes, jaw-length hair tucked behind one ear in a truce. "I pulled their initial labs," she said without preamble, setting the kit down like a resupply drop. Elevated liver enzymes across the board, cholinesterase depressed, fits with organophosphate exposure. I sent fur scrapings and vomitus, don't thank me, to the state lab. We won't get their fancy stamp for a bit, but the story is already loud. She tapped the bag of swabs. If you insist on going nosing around, take this. Don't touch with bare hands, bag anything that looks like it tells a story, label time and place. And if someone is there, you leave. I like my clients breathing. The last sentence was not a joke. Her eyes held the kind of steel you put into bridges. "I'll be careful," he said, "because promises are narrower than hopes, but they hold better." He told her about the industrial, solvent-sharp smell in the bags, and about the way the knots had been tied, all function, no care. Emily nodded, filing it in the place inside her where patterns live. "I'll talk to animal control, get a quiet net in the water. Meanwhile, you keep your head down. And Logan," she angled her face to catch his full attention, "you're not hunting, you're gathering. That's a different animal." He started where any Marine would, at the nearest neighbor with time and eyes. The bait shop on Harbor Street had a wide porch that sagged in the middle, and a bell that clanged like an old joke when he pushed the door. The air smelled like brine and coffee, and the thousand small betrayals of pilchard. Behind the counter stood a woman in her late 50s wearing a flannel in a shade of optimistic red, her hair silver and curly as a kelp holdfast, a pencil tucked behind her ear as if she were daring the day to need math. Mabel Ortiz had hands with square fingertips and nail polish bitten down to its usefulness. Her face wore a permanent squint you get from sunlight, not suspicion. She greeted him with her chin first, then her mouth. "You're the one with the 3, she said, not unkindly. "Sit. My coffee's the sort you apologize for while pouring. You want some?" He did, because saying no to offered coffee in a small town is like refusing a life raft on principle. He slid a photo across the counter he'd taken on his second morning. 3 bowls, 3 noses, 3 different ways of approving of food. Found them in trash bags by the river. You see any vans out after midnight near the cannery? Crates? Lights where they shouldn't be? Vans? Mabel snorted softly, then made a face as if the coffee had embarrassed itself. "I see vans every night. Contractors who never contracted anything but excuses. But yes, last Thursday, 2 in the morning, white panel, no logos, fresh dirt on the wheel wells like they'd been where the county doesn't pave. They stopped near Warehouse 3. Men got out. No talking. Just that body language men get when they're doing a thing they want finished before dawn. One had a cap pulled low, and the other had a limp that looked practiced. They carried something in that was heavier than fish." She held his gaze as if offering a dare. "Do what you want with my words, but don't file them under gossip." He thanked her like you thank a person for lending you a tool that will come back nicked, and he paid for jerky he didn't want as a way to respect the economy of the porch. On his way out, a man brushed by in a brown Carhartt jacket, 30s, narrow through the hips from a life of lifting wrong, acne scars on his cheeks like an old constellation, a baseball cone with the brim sweat white. He had oil under his nails and a stare that slid off faces like rain from tar paper. Evan Laird, The name came later from a dockhand who swore he wasn't swearing. Laird didn't look at Logan like a challenge. He looked like a man who had learned to get small when the big things showed up. He bought bait with cash, fingers trembling the tiniest bit, and left without the bell bothering to ring. Logan banked the face. He had learned to remember without telling memory what weight to give. By afternoon, he stood on the edge of the port where the old cannery sat with its teeth pulled, long windows bricked over, siding scabbed with salt blown in from bad winters. Warehouse 3 brooded at the far end like a thought you couldn't finish. Rex was the only dog with him, secured in the harness by a lead that attached to Logan's belt, as if they were the same machine. Shadow and Titan had stayed at the cabin, with a puzzle feeder and a classical station playing on the EHI radio. It wasn't that Beethoven cured trauma, but structure sometimes coaxed calmness into the room without introducing more ghosts. He paused to let the shepherd smell the corner post. P-mail, the old joke, but the layers of scent speak of territory and trespass. Rex lifted his head after a long read, ears angled forward, and breathed in again like the air had said a word he half knew. "Easy," Logan murmured, not as a correction, but as a blessing. He slid gloves from Emily's bag onto his hands and moved along the building's shadow side, where gull feathers and the humped brown nests of old rope made a study in textures. He found the first thing that told a story under a drainpipe, a lint trap of fur caught on a splintered pallet, not the soft tumbleweed of shedding, but a clutch of short guard hairs broken as if by struggle, black and tan, and something like powdered cinnamon. He swabbed, sealed, labeled with time, date, and GPS on the back of a feed store receipt, because paper is paper in a pinch. Farther on, he found a plastic jug, lying on its side near a rusted barrel, its label bleached to unreadable and its cap missing. The mouth stank the thin, mean stink of solvent. He tipped it. One last viscous tear crawled out and made the gravel shine. Into a bag it went, zip whispering closed like a secret choosing not to be one. He almost missed the medallion of duct tape pressed to the concrete near a loading dock, stuck with dog hair and something darker. He lifted one edge with a putty knife and slid a swab over the tacky side. When he held the cotton up, color whispered into it, brown-red, dried, not paint. He swallowed the way you do when you remember thirst at an inopportune time. The day slanted toward late. The gulls changed diction. The air grew thinner, and the public world folded itself to close. Logan rounded the back corner of the warehouse and almost ran into the story walking on two legs. The man stood where a loading ramp made a stage of broken concrete, the same build as in the bait shop, same cap, same jacket, same way of taking up less space than his bones would suggest. Up close, Evan Laird smelled like bleach that had tried and failed to make itself invisible. His eyes hit Logan's face and slid off, hit Rex and stuck there in the way men do when they have underestimated dogs their whole lives. He did not put his hands up or out. He did the third thing, which is to reach for his pocket out of habit. Logan saw the move and stepped in, not aggressive, not timid, just enough to let the air know what he intended. "Don't," he said, "because words can be the fence." "I'm on public property," Laird muttered, jaw working at nothing. Up close, his left ear had a chunk missing, as if someone had taught him a lesson he'd partially learned. The tremor in his hands grew, a tide under skin. "You got a reason to—" "Looking for a reason," Logan said, and it came out calm. Rex's stance sharpened without noise. His weight shifted to the front, eyes bright, ears pricked, tail neither high nor tucked, the posture of a dog announcing that honesty would be wise. Laird's gaze flicked to the shepherd, and then to the alley as if trying to calculate how far a man could run with lungs that had carried more than smoke. He chose flight because some men only have two verbs. He spun, hit the ramp edge with a shoe that had lost its tread weeks ago, and went down hard in a skid that peeled a strip of skin from his palm. He scrambled up, made the alley's mouth, and disappeared into the geometry of pallets and shadow. Logan did not chase. This was not a war with territory in it. He moved to where Laird had fallen and found the things men shed when they hurry. A cheap folding knife whose blade was missing a tip from some argument with wire, a cotton glove with the fingers cut off, and the length of chain that would become the hinge of this story. It was about 2 feet, galvanized, one end a quick link with its screw collar stuck half open, the other end bent into a hook by the kind of force that is both strength and boredom. Links near the center wore a brown varnish that had not flaked despite salt and weather, and caught in one weld was a short tuft of hair, coarser than Rex's, more like Titan's mahogany guard hairs, but lighter, almost blonde at the tip where sun had done its slow alchemy. When he lifted the chain, a flake of dried matter the color of old pennies fell to the concrete and broke into two. Blood is a vocabulary even after it stops talking. He bagged the chain gloved, labeled it, photographed the scrape on the ramp where the glove had left a smear, took one picture of his boots beside the evidence because size is an honesty check. He stood in the dying light and listened. The gulls, the drip inside pipes, a distant forklift complaining that it had done enough this week. He let his breath come down out of his chest to where it belonged, then he dialed Emily on the old flip phone he carried when his smarter one felt like a liability. She picked up on the second ring as if she had been sitting beside it, reading its mind. "Tell me you're calling to say you found nothing." "I found a chain," he said, "blood on it, hair caught in a weld, jug with solvent stink, tape with trace, and a man who ran like he's practiced." He described the face, the jacket, the missing tip of the ear, the way nervousness had a rhythm. "I didn't chase." "Good," Emily said, and the word had the force of a hug delivered by a drill sergeant. "Bring it all here first. I'll log what we can and call Reyes at Animal Control with a heads up. She knows which officers can handle quiet without making noise. Logan, be home before dark. You've earned one good decision today. Don't trade it for a bad one." He hung up, patted Rex's shoulder, and let the shepherd lean into him for a second, like gravity had asked. The sky over the bay was the color of bruised plums. A single star had the effrontery to show up early. He walked back along the warehouse wall, with the bagged chain heavy in his pocket and the knowledge heavier. Somewhere, a door would open soon, and on the other side of it would be a room where the truth had been kept on a leash too short for too long. Word got around the way it always does in a harbor town. First on a porch over coffee, then at the bait counter, then through a dozen phones buzzing in pockets that smelled of cedar and salt. By week's end, Port Silverton had turned its face toward the cabin on the bluff. The mornings were clearer now, glassy light rolled off the water, and the gulls argued like politicians only about fish. Logan woke into a routine that had deepened into muscle memory. Bowls, pills, a slow loop in the clearing while mist threaded the firs. Rex moved with that square, deliberate confidence of a German shepherd, back in dialogue with his body. Shadow's step was still quick, ears doing their small calculations. Titan paced with a veteran's economy, large head held level, a question always forming and sometimes answered. The first knock came from a woman in a flour-dusted sweatshirt and running shoes, her blonde hair pinned in a practical knot, cheeks winter apple pink from the slope of the bluff. Paula Merritt, who ran the bakery down on Harbor Street, had the compact build of someone who lifted sacks of flour like thoughts, and eyes that crinkled even when she didn't mean to smile. "I heard you've got patience," she said, shifting a cardboard flat in her arms. "I know, dogs don't eat cinnamon rolls, people do, but people who save dogs forget to eat. These have a moral purpose." Behind her appeared Sunil Patel, mid-40s, owner of Harbor Hardware, wiry, precise, beard-trimmed, like a promise kept. He carried a bundle of PVC pipes, a spool of nylon rope, and a bucket of mismatched carabiners. "Returns box ate these," he said dryly. "I'd rather see them become a tunnel than die in aisle 5. He had an engineer's voice that made even jokes sound load-bearing. They placed their offerings on the porch as if laying a table for a wake that wasn't going to be necessary. Later came Eleanor Cruz, a retired schoolteacher with a cane that had given up on complaining, bringing a box of blankets folded so carefully the creases felt ceremonial. The Fisher twins, high school wrestlers with shoulders like furniture and soft eyes, delivered hay bales and stayed to sweat them up the hill without being asked. Roy Pike, the crabber with the black cap who had met Titan on the road, returned bareheaded with a duffel of old marine rope that had the right kind of give. Mabel Ortiz from the bait shop sent a thermos of coffee and a note that said simply, "For building, for holding." Even June Alvarez appeared at the fence line in her daisy-cuffed rain jacket, solemn as a witness, offering 3 tennis balls which she arranged in a perfect triangle and then saluted with the seriousness of a captain christening a ship. Logan didn't mount speeches because gratitude sat quietest when it stayed true. He nodded, said thank you like a carpenter uses a square, and wrote names in his pocket notebook with the neat script of a man who had been taught that records are a hedge against chaos. The first day of building was more choreography than construction. Thomas Briggs arrived just before noon in a dust-colored pickup spattered with old mud, as if it had been somewhere, and declined to brag about it. Thomas was 38, all long lines and runner's leanness, with a sun-bitten face and a jaw peppered by an old scar that looked like someone had tried to draw a river and lost interest halfway through. His hair was dark and cut short enough to confess he didn't often bother with mirrors. His eyes were the flat, steady green-gray of bay water on a windless afternoon. He wore a faded ball cap with the outline of a dog stitched in white, jeans with a knee patched twice, and boots that said he had never learned to walk any other way than on dirt. He moved like a person who assumed he'd be useful and felt embarrassed when he wasn't. He and Logan had shared years back in places where heat had weight, and choices were timed by other people's clocks. Thomas had been a canine handler then, working alongside a dog called Rook, who had the patience of an old priest. When Rook died of a tumor 3 years after they came home, Thomas built a training yard in his backyard and started helping handlers who didn't have time to get soft. The grief had gentled some edges and sharpened others. His humor had a dry tick to it. His kindness kept receipts. "You look exactly the same," Thomas said by way of greeting, which meant older, thinner, more yourself. He set a duffel on the porch and unzipped it to reveal a tangle of tools and talismans. A clicker scored smooth by years of thumbs, a tug toy braided from old fire hose, a handful of rubber bumpers, a set of light plastic cones, a coil of fluorescent survey tape. "Loners," he said. "Rook would haunt me if they gathered dust." The yard became a design problem they solved together. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped gently to a stand of alder. They staked out an oval with rope and cones, laid hay bales as borders, and dragged pallets into place for a low walkover. Sunil's PVC became jump uprights wrapped in old fire hose, so a missed leap would forgive. A length of culvert from a neighbor's drainage project became a tunnel after the Fisher twins cut it into a 6-foot section and sanded the edges smooth. A tarp strung between two poles, pegged low, became a confidence curtain that asked a dog to push through something that felt like weather. Thomas explained everything in sentences that didn't posture. "We're not teaching circus tricks. We're giving them choices that earn paychecks. We'll be generous with wins, stingy with asks." Rex went first because leadership sometimes means being the first one to look foolish and not mind. Harness on, lines slack, he took the low pallet with a neat step and then another, his tail set at half-mast, eyes flicking to Logan for a grammar check, then forward to the next task. Over a few tries, he learned the math of it. Step, step, reward. A quiet good, a finger's worth of something that smelled like roast chicken. He pushed his nose through the tarp once, startled at the brush of fabric, then decided the world didn't end, and did it again with less drama, receiving from Thomas a click and a small cheer that carried no embarrassment, only accuracy. Shadow approached like a scholar who thought tests were traps. Thomas used distance and choice like instruments, letting her watch Rex complete 2 passes without pressure. Then he marked the moment her ears tilted forward, interest blooming, and paid that thought with a tossed treat, landing 2 feet closer to the line. She came forward in fractions, front paws on the first pallet, then off, then on again, until the act of standing on the wood was its own champagne pop. Titan lay in the shade under the alder, stretched long, chin on paws, watching. "Watching is a job, too," Thomas said. "He's writing it down," he murmured, the side of his mouth ticking upward. "He'll pretend he isn't, and then he'll show you he was." The town kept showing up. Planks appeared, someone offered old pea gravel to tamp down mud, a yoga studio donated a stack of retired mats that became traction on slick boards. Paula brought dog-safe biscuits that smelled faintly of peanut butter and virtue. A teenager from the high school shop class, Miguel Ramos, lanky, hoodie sleeves too long, hair in a curl over one brow, arrived with a cordless drill and the soft shyness of people who would rather talk to wood. "My uncle does fences," he said, already squaring a pallet with his foot. "I can make that A-frame not wobble like my grades." He set about it with a seriousness that turned wobbly into sure. Days became a rhythm, morning care, short quiet walks, an hour in the yard while the sun was kind, breathers whenever Shadow's pupils went too big, or Titan's tongue told us he'd said enough. Emily stopped by twice with a tote of electrolyte mix and a professional eye, her slate scrubs trading places with a navy rain jacket. She stood just outside the rope and let her presence land like a benediction, saying little, watching much. Even Officer Reyes from Animal Control, a woman in her late 30s with hair braided tight and boots that had never seen a desk day, stepped up to the rope on her off hours, bareheaded, hands open. She didn't touch, didn't crowd, only watched Titan with a small, respectful nod. The kind of nod law enforcement gives to anyone who understands duty. "So Lane's quiet for now," she said to Logan without naming lanes. "Keep doing what you're doing. It helps." Rex took to the weave poles with an economy that made Thomas laugh under his breath. Shadow learned to target a hand with her nose, tentatively at first, then with the certainty of a student who has finally understood the theorem. Titan moved circles closer each day, not because anyone pulled him, but because the yard kept making sense. He had opinions about the tunnel. The first time he placed a foot on the culvert's lip, he paused so long that a sparrow landed on the rope line, reconsidered life, and left. Logan let the pause be a teacher. He sat on the ground at the tunnel's exit, legs out, back leaning on hay, a ridiculous man with a pride he didn't know how to hold in his hands. "No clock," Thomas murmured. "Time is a tool for us, not a leash for him." The video would later seem short, because victory always edits itself, but the day it happened was a necklace of hours. It was a Wednesday with a sky like denim washed thin, the wind full of kelp and sun-warmed rope. June was at the fence with her grandmother, Mrs. Alvarez, a small woman in a cardigan that had known 3 daughters and a lifetime of wash lines, silver hair in a loose bun, eyes kind and taking no nonsense. Roy stood by the gate holding the cap in his pocket, as promised, and Mabel leaned her elbows on the top rail, coffee in a thermos and eyebrows saying, "Don't mess this up. Fate." Rex had just cleared the A-frame cleanly, and Shadow had nosed the hand target through the curtain without flinching. Titan stood at the mouth of the culvert, the mahogany gloss on his cheeks lit up like varnish under afternoon light. He looked at the dark. He looked at Logan. He looked at the dark again. Logan didn't say anything at first, because sometimes silence is the scaffolding for courage. Then he patted his thigh once, the quietest metronome in the world, and shifted his weight an inch back so the tunnel's exit became not a demand, but a doorway to him. Titan put one paw in, then backed out. He did it again. Third time, a breath sat deep in his ribs and found its level. He lowered his head and went into the dark. Halfway through, something clicked. Not plastic, not camera, but an old lock finding its key. He trotted the last 3 feet and bursted out into sun, shook his shoulders like a gentleman removing rain, and, God help the men who had taught him fear, he play-bowed. It was small, almost sheepish, elbows out, rump high, a question mark made of joy. For a second nobody made a sound, because the air itself was full. Then June whooped once, a sound too big for her jacket. Mabel laughed like a bell that had been waiting. Roy said, "Well, I'll be," as if he'd seen tides reverse and been less impressed. Thomas breathed out a word that could have been a prayer or a curse of thanks. Logan's throat closed around something good and old. He stepped forward on knees that had learned other kinds of kneeling and set his hand on Titan's broad head, the fur warm and clean and real. "You're free now, buddy," he said, the sentence almost not making it past the weight in his chest. Titan answered with a tail thump that started awkward and then decided to be confident. Later, when the yard was quiet and the light had leaned golden against the alder, Thomas packed the duffel as if tucking a child into bed. "You've got yourself a team," he said, not as flattery, but as a field report. Not because they obey, because they choose. Logan nodded, looking at the 3 of them sprawled like punctuation around the yard. Rex, a colon ready to introduce the next thing. Shadow, an ellipsis promising continuation. Titan, a firm, generous period. The town drifted off in 2s and 3s, leaving rope and mats and 100 small proofs of hands. Paula pressed a paper sack into Logan's hands, rolls, 2 apples, a note that read, "You're allowed to rest," and Sunil promised to drop off a proper tunnel frame once his supplier felt generous. June tucked an index card into the fence. Titan equals brave in letters that got bigger as they went. The evening brought back the long, kind shadows and the stove's chuckle. Inside, the cabin smelled of clean dog and warm wool and a sliver of cinnamon that had snuck out of Paula's bag. On the table, Logan opened his notebook and wrote not just doses and feedings, but a single line that he underlined twice. First play. Sometimes that's the blueprint. The morning after Titan's first play bow, Port Silverton wore a sky rinsed clean. The bay a calm coin. Gulls stitching slow white seams across the blue. Under that ordinary mercy, the work turned serious. Emily called just after sunrise, voice level, words clipped for cargo. The state lab had rushed a preliminary. Organophosphate traces on the fur swabs, solvent residue matching a commercial degreaser in the jug, blood on the chain consistent with canine origin. Animal Control Officer Reyes had looped in the county, and a judge had signed a warrant on the strength of Emily's logs, Logan's labeled evidence, and a week of quiet surveillance from a pair of deputies who could keep their boots from squeaking. They moved before noon because bad men count on dark. Warehouse 3 blinked into life under strobes of red and blue, not theatrical, just visible, as a short convoy slid into the lot. 2 sheriff's SUVs, an animal control van with its back stacked in neat cages, and a white box truck borrowed from the county maintenance yard for whoever needed moving without a back seat. Reyes stepped down in a plain field jacket and duty boots that told the ground they'd met before. Late 30s, hair braided tight, calm threaded with steel, the kind of officer whose voice makes rooms coordinate. With her came Deputy Marcus Hale, big-shouldered and soft-eyed, mid-40s, beard salted early by kids and swing shifts, the sort of man who could lift a refrigerator one-handed and whisper to a kitten with the other. And Detective Sarah Kim, compact and unblinking, black suit under a windbreaker, hair in a practical bun, a thin scar at her knuckle from a long-ago bicycle fall that had taught her to keep her hands where she could see them. Reyes read the warrant at the loading dock door like a teacher reading a rule everyone knew, and Hale's Halligan popped the old hasp with a disappointed sigh. The smell hit first, ammonia and rinse agent and the iron note of neglected bowls. Then the keening, high, hoarse, and too tired to be loud, folded in around the throats of the living. Inside the long room, light fell in rows through plastic skylights smudged to gray, across wire crates stacked too high, across plywood pens, across a plastic kiddie pool turned whelping box, across a battered scale, a whiteboard with numbers that weren't names, a 5-gallon bucket of something that had once been food but had given up. Dogs looked up with the eyes of the betrayed and the hopeful, shepherds like Rex, Dobermans like Shadow, Rottweilers like Titan, plus beagles, pits, a pair of skinny hounds, a one-eyed mutt whose whole vocabulary was, "Take me." Reyes split the room without shouting. Hale, right lane, Sarah, document left to right, gloves on, bag chemicals, live animals first, and the choreography began. Doors opened, muzzles placed only where reflex required, bodies lifted with a kindness that apologized for human hands. Emily had stayed at the clinic to set up triage, a back room converted into emergency lanes, stainless tables lined with towels, IV poles improvised from broom handles and tape, Kara and Tessa moving like a 2-person orchestra, but she'd sent a pair of folding crates and a cooler of electrolyte mix along with a note that only said, "Come fast." Logan wasn't supposed to be inside. He knew the dance well enough to stay out of the way, but Reyes waved him in with a 2-finger point when a Rottweiler in a back pen wouldn't let anyone near. Male, broad-chested, but reduced by weeks of not enough, eyes a wary amber, the color of old varnish. The cap on the head of the man who had run in the alley must have been a frequent visitor here. "Talk to him," Reyes said, not as an order, but as a tool. Logan crouched sideways, voice low, nonsensical. Words aren't the point, tone is. "Hey, big fella. That's right. The door's going to open and it won't close on you again." The big dog sniffed, froze at the first lift of the latch, then chose curiosity and stepped into air that didn't have bars in it. Hale slid a lead gently over his head. The dog sighed in that full-body way dogs do when something complicated lets go. They worked an hour and a half before the warehouse felt less like a bad decision and more like a crime scene quitting its job. 23 dogs crated and loaded, 7 puppies bundled in blankets that used to belong to a county office, 3 cats and carriers that smelled offended, a cockatiel in a shoebox with air holes because sin has no taste. Detective Kim photographed everything. Chains, the whiteboard with litters and dollar signs, the open jug mouths, the pale circles on concrete where bowls had sat too long. She found 3 debit receipts in a metal box showing feed store runs at 1 in the morning, and a ledger on a clipboard that had "Return to R" scrawled in a corner. No arrests at the scene. That would come when wrists could be named and hands placed where they belonged. For now, Reyes did the other thing she does. She called the clinic, and the town moved like water through a channel that had been cut for it. At Hartman Veterinary, the bell rang and did not stop for an hour. Kara and Tessa triaged with hands and eyes that had learned to carry 2 truths: be gentle, be fast. Emily moved from table to table like a field commander. Decontaminate, fluids, antiemetic, airway, repeat. She sent the worst to the back, where heat lamps made a makeshift sun. She stood in a doorway and caught Logan with her gaze when he paused to put down a crate. He looked exactly like the men she'd sent home from emergency calls. Shoulders adrenaline, hands steady because they had to be. "You're not failing anyone," she said, as if answering a thought he hadn't spoken. "You're here. That counts." He nodded once, too full to risk words. 3 days later, paper became as important as food. The district attorney's office sent Assistant DA Dana Liu, early 40s, compact as a good argument, hair cut in a swing that did not swing, suit the practical gray of asphalt after rain. She had courtroom warmth only when it bought her credibility, but her eyes were kind to victims and occasionally to witnesses who didn't know they were heroes. "I need the chain of custody tight enough to play a tune on," she said to Logan in Emily's back room, flipping open a yellow legal pad already graph-papered with line items. "Emily, I'll need medical records, lab results, body weights, injuries, photos before and after. Kara, tag those with dates like they owe you rent. Mr. Mercer, your notes, times, locations, who saw what. And if we have members of the community with photos or video, point me at them, and I will point subpoenas at their phones in the friendliest possible way." She smiled, which was to say she did not. Mabel had a security camera pointed toward the Cannery Road because theft had visited twice, and she did not believe in a third. She produced 2 clips of white vans, the timestamp carving the hour Mabel had named. Sunil had a receipt with a license plate impression, faintly mirrored on the backing paper. Roy had a memory like rope, textures, weights, hat brims, limps. Reyes and Detective Kim walked Dana through the warehouse photos, the ledger, the chemical inventory. A name bubbled up and stuck. Rick Danner, mid-50s, a man with a strip of auto garages and a history of treating living things like errands. Evan Laird showed up under Danner's shadow, the sort of employee who calls other men boss, whether they are or not. They were arrested a week later with a bail hearing that had Dana's voice clipped to its steel core and Danner's lawyer, Hal Prince, a suit and shoes too pointy for this county, arguing that his client merely stored property as a favor. The judge who signed the warrant, Meredith Holloway, 60s, silver bob, a face carved into fairness and fatigue, looked over her glasses in a way that made the room sit taller and said, "I'll see." The courthouse smelled of lemon oil and old paper. On the morning of the hearing that mattered, Logan stood in a hallway outside Department 3 with a stack of his own notes squared in his hand, and the sensation you get before you jump into cold water. Emily found him leaning against a bulletin board under a flyer for a pancake breakfast that promised, "All you can eat for $5 if $5 is all you have." She wore a navy blazer over scrubs because life is messy, hair tucked behind one ear with a pencil like Mercy in holster. "I keep thinking about Ruiz," he said quietly, not looking at her, as if speaking too loud would wake something. "The day we carried him down the hill. I keep thinking about all the times I did everything right and it wasn't enough. I don't want to—" He stopped, because endings sometimes are just a lack of air. Emily shifted closer into his, field of vision, her eyes steady at a human distance. "You're not here for orders," she said. "Not gentle, not hard. You're here for love. That is not a guarantee of outcome. It's better. It's the only thing that changes a room." He nodded, and some wire inside him stopped humming. Inside, Ade Liu called witnesses like placing stones in a river so the jury could cross. Reyes first, with photos and chain of custody. Kim with the ledger and chemical matches. Emily with her medical records and lab confirmations. Mabel with the van and time, Sunil with the scraps that look like nothing until they don't, and then Logan. He took the stand in a clean shirt he hadn't worn since a funeral, shoulders square, not because pride demanded it, but because truth does. Dana's questions were soft-voiced, but built like scaffolds. Where he found the bags, what he smelled, what he saw, how he cut them open, how he carried, how he labeled, how he delivered. She asked nothing he couldn't answer, and he did not embroider because facts do their own heavy lifting when allowed. Prince tried to nick him on chain of custody and motivation. "You seem invested, Mr. Mercer?" And Logan, who had learned to answer the question asked, and not the insult implied, said, "Yes." Then Dana laid the chain on the evidence table, tag crisp, links dull, pointed to the dried stains now translated by lab sheets, and to the hair caught in a weld that matched, within reason, the guard hair sample Emily had pulled from Titan's shaved patch. She placed the ledger beside it, a line item dated 3 nights before the rescue. GSD 2F 1M unsellable. Prince objected. The judge overruled. The mechanism of justice turned a notch. Before she rested, Dana asked the court's permission to play a short compilation of images. Crates opened, animals lifted, bowls filled, and, because truth isn't always ugly, Titan stepping from the tunnel and dropping into a bow like an oath turned inside out. Prince objected to relevance. Dana said, "Foundation for harm and recovery, Your Honor." Judge Holloway watched with a face that did not change and then said, "Proceed." The sound in the room thinned to the soft clack of the court reporter's keys. Dana turned back to Logan for one last question she hadn't previewed, because real moments rarely are. "Mr. Mercer," she said, voice lower, "when you first saw those bags, what did you think you were looking at?" Logan looked at the table, then at the jury, farmers and clerks, and a barista in a jacket too thin for the air, human and imperfect and paying attention. He could have said trash, and the word would have been true. He could have said crime, and that would have fit. He could have said nothing, and the silence would have been understandable. He chose a sentence he had earned. "They are not trash," he said, and he did not raise his voice. "They are family." It was not a performance. It was a small pane of glass held up to the light. Something in the room eased. Even the defense table knew what had just happened. Judge Holloway did not emote. Her job was to calculate. But when she leaned forward later for sentencing, after the jury took less time than lunch to convict Danner on multiple counts of animal cruelty, illegal breeding and environmental violations, and layered on conspiracy and cruelty, her voice carried that particular weight justice uses when it stops apologizing. She banned both men from owning animals for life, assessed fines that would pull at them for years, and handed down confinement long enough to be a chapter, not a paragraph. "The law is not a poem," she said, looking over those glasses, "but it can be a line break between what was and what will be." In the back row, Logan let out a breath he did not know he'd stored. Emily touched his shoulder with 2 fingers, an anchor and a benediction. Reyes nodded once, the small salute professionals give each other when a job finds its proper ending. Outside, the courthouse steps were warm in the afternoon sun. A gull argued with a lamppost about nothing important. Logan stood with his hands empty for the first time in weeks and thought of 3 beds on a cabin floor, a kettle that needed descaling, a yard that had learned to hold joy. The day went on as if it hadn't changed anything, but it had. Morning came in the color of polished pewter, the bay a mirror tilted toward the sky, the flag at the cannery barely lifting, as if saving its breath for later. In that quiet light, a sealed envelope slid under the cabin door like a tide note. The letterhead wore a compass rose, and the name of a regional foundation known less for speeches than for roofs that didn't leak, North Coast Stewardship Fund. The writer, Clara Winslow, introduced herself without adjectives. Mid-50s, tall in practical boots, salt-streaked hair in a low twist, a face that didn't do makeup because it didn't do pretending. She had grown up on a dairy 2 counties inland and learned early that charity is a verb measured by hands and hours. Her note was plain. "We saw what you in this town did at Warehouse 3. If you'll accept it, we'd like to sponsor the conversion of your place into a proper sanctuary, kennels with drainage, a rehab pen, storage, basic ADA access, and a small room for counseling. You'll run it. We'll fund it. You choose the name. She signed it with a phone number and the sentence, "My father believed good work deserves a roof." Logan read it twice, then once out loud to the dogs, because some news needs to make a sound to become real. Rex sat square in the doorway as if already guarding an institution. Shadow tilted her fine-boned head at the word counseling, like a student learning there was a subject for fear. Titan sniffed the paper carefully, as if cataloging the intentions baked into the fibers. When Clara came that same afternoon in a county truck with mud up to the wheel wells, she shook Logan's hand like you shake a friend you haven't met yet, and ducked to scratch Titan's chest with a familiarity that passed the Rottweiler test. "My dad had a dog named Duke who convinced us all we were better people than we were," she said, eyes roaming the yard, mapping as she looked. "I like what you've built with rope and kindness. Let's make it so it lasts." Logan led her around the clearing that had become an obstacle course, past the makeshift tunnel and the A-frame Miguel had squared like a promise, to the back of the cabin where the alder cast good shade. Clara's project manager, Gus Harlan, followed at a distance with a notebook and a carpenter's pencil behind one ear. Gus was late 50s, wide through the chest like a wood stove, beard white as rope, forearms a knotwork of old burns. He'd been an electrician in the shipyards and walked like a man who measured time in circuits. He didn't talk much. He measured twice and nodded once, eyes curious but not nosy. "We'll pour a slab here for a kennel row," Clara said, sweeping a hand at the flat patch near the alder. "Drainage to a gravel bed. Insulated room off the end, heat in winter, fan in summer. A secure fence with a gate that even a clever Rottweiler can't figure out when he's bored." She turned to Logan. "For the people side, we'll frame, in a small office, couch, 2 chairs. If you'll let me, I'll ask a friend to donate a few hours a week of counseling for vets who don't like fluorescent lights." Her friend turned out to be Dr. Avery Cole, early 50s, compact, dark curls threaded with silver, sneakers and a cardigan as her uniform, eyes soft but professional, the kind of clinician who had learned to listen to the part of a story that never makes it to words. Avery had worked 15 years in a VA clinic and left when paperwork grew taller than the men. She had a folded paper crane on her desk for every patient who found a way to sleep. "I don't proselytize," she told Logan on her first walkthrough, her voice low and steady. "I don't prescribe here. I sit in a room while people put down something heavy, and I help them pick up something livable." She watched Rex watch her, then sat on the floor at Shadow's height, letting the Doberman decide when to close the distance. "I've met co-therapists with worse credentials," she added, and Shadow's tail did a small, involuntary beat that felt like a signature. The town came again, this time with blueprints. Sunil ran conduit with Gus for the outlet that would feed heat lamps. The Fisher twins shoveled gravel like they were burying winter. Paula kept a carafe line going like a field kitchen. Mabel turned the bait shop into a donation hub for towels, bleach, and hope. Officer Reyes stopped by in off-duty jeans and boots that looked weird without a radio, hauling a rolled panel of welded wire in her truck bed. "I found an extra panel in the county yard," she said, split grin. "Don't ask me how." The kid, June, arrived with a bundle of posters she'd lettered in the neat, careful capitals of 9-year-olds who like rules. Wash hands. Use quiet voice. Dogs are learning. People are too. She had recruited 2 friends, Theo, all elbows and freckles, shy but with a laugh that burst out like a cork, and Ruby, a blunt-banged serious child who asked brilliant questions about everything. They formed a junior committee and took their work like play and their play like work. In a week, the cabin grew outposts, a row of weatherproof kennels under a shed roof, each with a raised bed and a nameplate slot, a small therapy room wearing a soft rug, and 2 lamps that conspired to make gentle light, a fenced yard with double gates and a sign Sunil hand-routed in cedar, "Welcome learners." Logan stood with Clara one evening while the concrete cured under plastic and the dogs explored the perimeter on long lines, sniffing each corner as if taking attendance. "About the name," Clara said, the sentence quiet in the closing light. "It has weight. Choose the weight you want to carry." Logan had been carrying 2 names in his pocket like 2 coins, one heavy with history, one broad with embrace. Haven of Valor carried the grammar of the Corps, the oath, the steel, the discipline that had saved him as much as it had broken him. Harbor of Hope sounded like the town itself, gentler, but no less determined, a place where boats and people come in beat up and leave repaired. He thought of June's careful posters, of Titan teaching himself to bow to wonder, of Rex's square steadiness, of Shadow's quiet decision to touch Avery's knee in the therapy room that afternoon. He thought of the flag he had folded too many times, and the way it could protect or become a burden. "Harbor of Hope," he said finally, tasting the shape of it in his mouth, seeing the letters in cedar. "Let the valor be in the work. Let the harbor be in the name." On opening day, the town wore overalls and Sunday clothes in the same crowd. A brisk wind came off the water and played the new flag on the fresh-painted pole, so the cloth spoke in flutters. Not triumph, not sorrow, just presence. Clara stood to one side with a clipboard she only glanced at when volunteers needed a place to pour themselves. Gus had on a clean shirt over his work jeans and looked baffled when strangers thanked him. Avery stacked pamphlets quietly on a table in the therapy room and hugged exactly one person, a woman with haunted eyes who laughed in relief before she cried. Emily arrived in a blazer over scrubs, caught between clinic and celebration, and slipped a small brass plaque into Logan's palm, engraved with the words, "For love, dressed as duty, no one left behind." "For the doorframe," she said. Thomas came with the duffel and a hat he never wore, and set the tug toys where little hands could find them. Reyes wore her badge hidden and her smile visible. ADA Dana Lou stopped by in jeans and an untucked shirt that proved she was capable of non-asphalt gray. The judge was not there. Good judges ghost their towns, but a clerk came with a bouquet and a handshake. Sarah Henley, the librarian who ran the children's hour, tall, gray hair in a bun that loosened by noon every day, long cardigan with elbow patches, widow of a firefighter who had taught her that bravery is quiet, arrived with a stack of dog books and a basket of bookmarks she'd tied with twine. "We'll read outside," she declared in a voice that could hush a gymnasium without scolding. "Shadow, if you're willing, will be our patron saint of not being afraid." Shadow was, as it turned out, exquisitely willing. On a blanket spread on the grass, 6 children gathered in a semicircle and took turns reading sentences that got smoother as a narrow Doberman leaned against each small knee in turn. Theo stumbled over a word, and Shadow placed her chin lightly on his shoe as if to steady the letters. Ruby asked whether dogs thought in pictures or smells, and Avery said yes, in a way that made both kids feel clever. Rex had a different charge. In the therapy room, on a soft rug, he learned to curl at the feet of visitors whose knees bounced and whose breath shortened when stories got near. Avery taught him the cue for "here" and the permission for "break," and in between he practiced being a hearth. Titan took the job he was born for, patrolling calm. He wore a wide, soft collar and walked perimeter with Logan through the day, greeting with a head nod like a doorman who knows everyone and is kindly suspicious of no one. When a hammer fell from a volunteer's pocket and clanged, he started and then let the old growl die, glancing to Logan and then to the children and deciding that the sound belonged to the present. People brought envelopes and $5 bills and a jar of change a barista had emptied because hope tips too. Someone pinned a pinned-on name on Logan that read, "The Marine and his 3 four-legged friends," and he blushed like a man caught doing what he was supposed to do. There were speeches, short because the wind had opinions. Clara said what she always said, that roofs matter and so do doors that open, and then stepped aside. Sunil thanked the screws for holding. Paula blessed the biscuits. Mabel told a story about a leak that got fixed because someone asked. June, pressed forward by Ruby and Theo, read from a note card in letters that got bigger when her heart did. "Thank you for making a place where dogs and people can be brave." In the pause that followed, a gull cried once as if to underline. Logan did not like microphones, and the town did not ask him to. He stood by the flagpole with the brass plaque in his pocket and looked at the crowd and then at the 3 faces that had taught him a new alphabet. He said, "This is yours," and that was enough. When the ribbon, a length of red survey tape Sunil insisted was better than silk, came down, the yard opened like a book at the right page. Rex trotted ahead into his post as if he had read the schedule. Shadow paused, checked the door, and then flowed after the children like a small shadow that made light better. Titan circled once with a rumbling acknowledgement of responsibility, and then, in a gesture that made more than one adult swallow hard, galloped to the long side of the fence, cut back, and chased nothing but air. The flag snapped smartly once in the harbor wind. Logan stood under it with the plaque warm in his palm, feeling the weight of a debt he had begun to pay, not by closing a ledger, but by opening doors. He looked at the running dogs, at the hands that had built this, at the faces that had learned to stay, and he whispered the only oath that had ever stuck in the places that mattered. No one left behind. Carry that light into your own days. In the kitchen sink, in the school drop-off, in the tired evening, choose one small act that says no one left behind. Open a door, leave a kind note, fill a bowl, listen longer than is convenient. When fear shows up, answer with presence. When the past shouts, answer with love. God is near in such moments. He does not always part the sea, but he does teach tired feet to walk through it. If this story gave you hope, share it with someone who needs a second wind. Leave a comment with one word to seal it in your heart and ours. Amen. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of rescue and redemption, and invite a friend to join us. Add your prayer below for the people and animals still waiting to be found, and may God bless and keep every viewer who made it to this line. Amen.